want to use my own presentation.
It'd be nice.
Hold on.
Just leave it up.
Stay tuned. Yeah, I'll just use this.
We go to the last slide. Yeah, that's what Mario. Not Madeline.
Here we go.
That's
That's
Madeline.
me.
There we go.
All right.
Yay.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Hi. Okay. As he said, I'm Piper, and I'm going to be talking about how children suffer from living in a world defined by gender, or as I like to say, a world of blue and pink. But when I say children, I mean it more of a general term because each factor of culture I'm going to discuss affects children at different ways, in different ways at different times of their lives. But the segregation does start earlier than most people would think. And to prove this to you, I was going to Google image search baby boy and baby girl so you could see. But in the interest of time, I've done it myself and screen capped the top results. So this is for boy. And this is for girl, and you maybe notice a color trend. Good, okay, all right, so we got that down. So it's interesting that children that are so young are already being separated into blue and pink. I wanted to show you another picture of something that kind of goes against norms. As a boy, I want you to notice his beautiful tutu and his pink ballet flats. We can probably agree that this is not normally how boys dress, but the thing that I want to challenge is that a lot of people would say that this is not how a boy should dress or that he's wrong for dressing that way. And that's the point of my symposium, is to challenge this idea for both boys and girls. I'm going to talk about how living in a world that thinks this way negatively affects a child's developing skill set, their authentic preference, and the way they feel about themselves and their peers. And the aspects of culture I'm going to focus on are media, specifically how men and women are represented in TV shows and movies, how toys and clothing are marketed at children, and how those factors directly and indirectly affect children. And then I'm also going to talk about children's own relationships and how those affect them as well. But before I start the true content of my paper, I want to define some terms, specifically sex versus gender, which are often used interchangeably, but are actually different things. The World Health Organization, there we go, says that male and female are sex categories, while masculine and feminine are gender categories. And for the purposes of my presentation, I'm going to be using words like gender stereotypes and gender roles, though I know not every sex relates to their gender and vice versa. I also want to say that I'm not trying to deny the natural difference between men and women. I'm just trying to challenge how amplified those differences are made to seem. A PhD, Liz Elliott, who wrote a book all about the differences between men and women, says that there are, to be sure, truly innate differences between the sexes, but the male-female differences that have the most impact are heavily shaped by learning. Yes, they germinate from basic instinct and initial biases in brain function, but each of these traits is massively amplified by the different sorts of practice, role models, and reinforcement that boys and girls are exposed to from birth onward. And the world was not always segregated into blue and pink. Another woman, Joby Paoletti, wrote a whole book about the evolution of sex-specific clothing, and in it she said, "White dresses were once like white t-shirts are today, essentially neutral, though capable of being gendered with the selection of trims and details. So at one time, there was no color segregation." And in 1918, Earnshaw's Children's Fashion magazine, which is actually still around today, said that the generally accepted rule is pink for the boys and blue for the girls. The reason is that pink, being a more decided and stronger color, is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl, which is interesting because, as we saw, that is not how things are today. And there's no real consensus about what changed the fad. Even the woman who wrote the book about sex-specific clothing said it was complicated, but in any case, it's different. But fashion is not the only thing that is stereotyped. I first want to focus on the various men and women that are stereotyped in media and how that affects children. I noticed this a lot when I was a big fan of the Disney Channel, and some of you might recognize this lovely family, Wizards of Waverly Place, okay? This family was like this, but it's not only this family that has these stereotypes, it's other families in the media too. Moms or women are often represented as like iron-fisted rulers, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're mean about it, but they're very clearly in charge, while the men are often represented as kind of dopey and bumbling. Also what happens is that women are presented as helpless, and they kind of need a man to help them. But then what also happens is that when women are not presented as helpless, they're over-sexualized, which is in the case of this. And it looks like Superman is being over-sexualized as well, because you can see his rippling muscles. But Wonder Woman is essentially wearing a swimsuit and high-heeled shoes, and Superman has clothes on. You can see that difference. In addition to adults, though, children are similarly stereotyped. The girls, this character was like this too, are often really sassy and smart, but kind of in a mean way, and it's kind of like the media lets them be mean about it, while the boys are similarly bumbling around or like generally messy. Or girls are like ditzy and guys are cool jocks, that sort of thing. And those are not balanced representations of men and women in the media. In 2004, a study done by students at NYU and Arizona State University revealed children as gender detectives, and that even subtle messaging about girls' and boys' roles in the media, in society, and on clothing affects the way kids see themselves. And as young people are constantly soaking up information from everywhere about how to behave and what to think, having an accurate and balanced representation of gender roles in the media is really important to their development. A PhD named Christia Spears Brown, who wrote a book all about how to raise your kid without gender stereotypes, told a story about how she went to her daughter's kindergarten class for her daughter's birthday, and she got to bring in a little Barbie doll and a toy car. And what the author noticed is that when the boys were handing around the Barbie dolls, they would often refuse to touch it or like throw it to the next girl because they were just so disgusted. And while the girls were more subtle, they also seemed disgusted at having to hold a toy car. And what's disheartening about this story is that these kids are so young, and they already had such a solid idea of which toy was for them, and such a solid dislike for the one that was not for them. And that brings us to the next thing that I want to talk about, which is how toys and clothing are marketed. And this is kind of clear if you've ever been to Target, like the toy section of Target. I was going to prove this to you by Google as well, but again, the interest of time, I've Googled toys for boys and toys for girls and screen capped the top results. So as you can see, toys for boys, often blue, highlight action and adventure and athleticism, while toys for girls, often pink, are like being pretty and homemaking. And this is not only single-minded, but it's also legitimately negative on a child's development. The PhD, Liz Elliott, who wrote the book about male and female differences, teaches that dolls, dress-up, and drawing promote fine motor, verbal, pre-literacy, nurturing, and empathetic skills, while trucks, balls, and wrestling promote gross motor, spatial, visual, competitive, and risk-taking skills. And these are skills that everyone should have. So, since different toys are being marketed towards different genders, the genders that those toys are not being marketed to are missing out on those skills. This type of restrictive marketing, although perhaps subtle or unintentional, encourages children to believe that the tough or adventurous stuff is for boys, while the easier and superficial stuff is for girls. There's an organization called the Representation Project, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. They kind of base all of their values on this one quote, "You can't be what you can't see." And in the grand scheme of things, toys don't seem that important, but because they're just toys. But if children aren't given examples of what they can be from a young age, when are they going to learn? And toys are not the only things being manipulatively marketed towards children. That brings us back to the clothing issue. An example of this, almost there. Okay, Joby Paoletti, the woman who wrote the book about the evolution of sex-specific clothing, said that the visual vocabulary of stereotypes seems endless. Pink and blue, ruffles and neckties, lace and camouflage, kittens and lions, butterflies and airplanes. And this is really important to the essence of what I want to talk about, because it talks about the segregation not just being pink and blue, although that's often how it starts, just as pink and blue. But as they get older, those colors represent or imply completely different things. And so an example of this, sometimes it's not just an implication, it's what's actually written on the clothing that's being marketed. So in 2011, JCPenney sold this real shirt. It said, "I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me." Yeah, no good. And it was quickly taken off the shelves because people were just so totally appalled that it was there. And there are a lot of shirts like that, or all sorts of clothing that are directly stereotyped. But there's also other shirts that just kind of highlight unbalanced values. Often for girls, those values are like shopping and rainbows and being pretty and I hate my brother. And for boys, it's often like sports and I'm really tough and I'm messy and I like to get into trouble. And those are not the only things. So athleticism and the positive sense of self, those sort of things are really valuable things to strive for, but they're not the only things to strive for, and they're not gender specific. A quote from an article I read on the topic in The Guardian said, "When it comes to the world of children, the toys they play with and the clothes they wear, stereotypes have never been so defined or rigidly enforced. Pink and blue have triumphed in the toy market, and there are often serious social penalties for children who breach the divide." And that quote is also really important to what I want to talk about because it highlights the social penalties involved with breaking the divide. And that's the next thing I want to talk about, how gender roles affect children in terms of socialization. Because media and marketing don't just affect the child directly, they also affect children's parents and peers who have an impact and influence on the child. In his medical thesis, Cognitive Aspects of Sexual Development, Dr. Bruce Carter says, "The mother or father who gasps or becomes uncomfortable upon seeing their little boy cook or play with dolls is simply passing on outdated schools of thought about what is acceptable for males and females." And parents are super important, of course, to their child's development. So if they have a response to a child's action that is severe, that response can leave a lasting construct in the child's mind. But an article in the New York Times mentioned that sometimes parents are trapped into thinking that way, and this is the quote, because they know that, "The social costs of boundary crossing and the peer pressure to stay within the lines are huge for kids and parents alike." So sometimes a parent's reaction isn't necessarily their views, but it's kind of fear-based because they know that the society is a kind of single-minded one and they're fearful for their child's future interactions. But in addition to parents, children's peers have a big influence on them, and this is where a lot of the social penalties and social costs come into play. It seems that especially when children are younger, like if a little boy wants to play with pink or wear pink, his friends are like, "That's girly," or like if a girl wants to like bugs or something, it's like, "Oh, that's gross." And that sort of insult to a child's natural preference can truly alter their natural preference if they feel like what they like is wrong. And I have an example of this, a personal one. This boy we saw earlier is my nephew. His name is Easton. And over the summer, he was super obsessed with Elsa from Frozen. Got it? Familiar? Okay. And he refused to be called his own name. Like, he would only respond to Elsa. And he watched the movie every day. It was great. But while he was here over the winter, I guess we're still in winter, but I asked him about Elsa and his interest. And he seemed kind of ashamed to like her still, which was unfortunate. But I asked his mom about it, and she said she noticed a change after he had started going to preschool, I think, but when he started hanging out with boys his age. And it is possible that his natural preference just changed. Maybe he just didn't like Elsa anymore. But I think that it's also possible that his friends at school were like, "Man, that's too girly," and he was like, "Oh, okay." And that's what I want to mention as well. Terms like manly and girly often go hand in hand with social penalties. The organization I talked about earlier, the Representation Project, has two really great documentaries about this topic. The first is called Misrepresentation. Notice, like, misrepresentation. It's about women. And how they're objectified in the media and how they're thought of as superficially and how that negatively impacts the people that are looking at the media and how that leads them to think of women in kind of skewed ways. And the second one is more male-focused, and it's called The Mask You Live In, and that focuses on how men and boys are always told, not always, but oftentimes told to like man up and to be a man, especially in terms of emotional expression. There are a lot of interviews with boys and men in this the mask you live in. Those boys that they're interviewing have trouble with anger and depression and low self-esteem that they attribute to feeling like they can't express their emotions. What's interesting is that, so the PhD Liz Elliott, who I mentioned earlier, wrote the book about male and female differences. She says that newborn boys are more irritable, cry sooner when distressed, and are less easy to console than newborn females. So it's interesting that as boys get older, they're less likely to cry than girls are. Crying is one of the few sex differences researchers unanimously agree is a matter of socialization. So it's really unfortunate that something so healthy, like letting out your emotions, has been constructed in such a negative way, and it's been constructed in a negative way by making it a feminine thing, which is putting femininity and something that's not good together, which is not only bad for the boys, but also for the girls. Because no child should feel bad or mistaken for expressing their true feelings, and that sort of conditioning and behavior can leave a really lasting impact. I also want to say, so in conclusion, I know that just because I'm so passionate about this does not mean that it doesn't lead to a world of change. It doesn't take away the well-meaning grandparents that buy Barbie dolls for their granddaughters or like G.I. Joes for their grandsons, and it doesn't take away the stereotypes in the media. Because media and marketing and friends and family, they make it really hard to think about children in a non-gender specific way and to act on those beliefs. Christia Spears Brown, the woman who visited her daughter's kindergarten class, declares that in today's world we have a cultural obsession with gender roles, but that even though those stereotypes are hard to fight, it is a good fight and ultimately worth it. So my challenge, the point of everything I'm saying, is just to encourage everyone to just be aware and to just think about why you're thinking what you're thinking or acting how you're acting, and to just be conscious of the gender roles in society, of the skewed men and women representations in the media, the way toys and clothing are being marketed, the skills that toys are teaching or not teaching, and just be aware of how that affects you and your children, or your children. Because boys and girls should feel free to equally and truly express themselves. They shouldn't have to feel ashamed of what they wear or what they think or what they want to play with, and they definitely shouldn't think that those things define them as human beings. Thank you.